You often hear comparisons between our deepest oceans and the vastness of outer space. It is an easy comparison to make, and in some ways a completely fair one, as both are vast, hostile, and difficult for human beings to survive in. Both are places where light disappears and pressure grows beyond our ability to withstand it. That said, space is out there, far beyond most of our reach, whereas with the sea, we can simply walk straight into it. For all of our progress, the deep remains one of the least understood places on Earth. We've sent machines into the void above our planet. We've mapped distant celestial bodies with astonishing clarity, and yet the vast stretches of the sea floor remain mysteriously unexplored amidst the pressure. To this day, creatures are still seen emerging that seem almost impossible to exist in the real world, whether they be too large or simply too alien for what we previously understood. Perhaps this is why the sea has always inspired such powerful stories, as our imaginations replace the darkness we cannot penetrate. For most of human history, sailors crossed waters they could not fully read, surrounded by depths they could not measure, and movements they could not yet explain, whether it be sudden stillness, an unnerving disturbance, or a dark shape where no land should be found. Our understanding of our blue planet may have grown over the years, and our scientific explanation for many of these strange occurrences may ease our anxieties, although that unnerving possibility seemingly remains, as we acknowledge the possibility that there are still things below the surface that we are yet to fully discover. My name is Luke Mordew, and this urban legend is the Kraken. For as long as people have crossed open water, they have, quite rightly, feared just what may be moving beneath them. When you're out at sea, far from the nearest bit of land, there is a particular kind of helplessness that comes with the knowledge that the world below you is deeper than you can measure and far darker than you can see into. A forest can be entered, a mountain can be climbed, and even the night sky, for all its vastness, remains something that we can at least look into if we require it. The sea, however, it carries you whilst also holding the ability to swallow you whole, and, at least until relatively recently, much of what lived within it remained hidden from sight. It is perhaps no surprise then that the ocean became home to some of humanity's oldest and most enduring monsters, with strange sightings, violent currents, and sudden disappearances being reported from all over as the sheer scale of the open water lent itself to stories that gave shape to the mysteries of its depths. The deeper and darker the sea seemed, the easier it became to imagine that something equally immense may very well be living within it. And over time, these fears were passed from sailor to sailor, spreading from coast to coast, until what may once have been merely a strange shape in the water became a titan of the ocean that all should fear. In my telling of an encounter with the Kraken, we will follow Rachel, who's working away at her new job. When Rachel was first offered the job as a kitchen porter on a luxury yacht, She had jumped at the chance. She had loved the idea of exploring incredible new countries whilst rubbing shoulders with the rich and powerful, especially when the alternative was to continue working as a cook at the local restaurant in Bergen. She had always been proud of her Norwegian heritage, and she loved her home, but there was a whole world out there that she wanted to explore, and this was a chance to do so. She may have gotten ahead of herself, she admitted that, often dreaming of meeting a charming, successful, but kind millionaire who would henceforth show her the world. That wasn't the only reason, of course, as she'd always held a great passion for cooking, and had always held the work chefs do in high regard, even from a young age. Although, what she was dealing with now wasn't quite what she had in mind. She felt stupid for being surprised by it. She'd worked in a kitchen before, although so much of that was microwaved. It turned out she was far more ignorant to the real cutthroat nature of a fast-paced kitchen, and although they were only ever cooking for the rich families upstairs, the pace was faster than she'd ever experienced before. She wouldn't have minded so much if she didn't feel the urge to punch the head chef in the head at least 3 times a day. He was a rude and arrogant man, the worst example of a man in power, with several comments that underlined a level of contempt towards her. "Rachel, get moving," he shouted across the kitchen, slamming various pots and pans on the stove as he began to fry the calamari. He'd sent her off to do the washing up, an action that she had taken up more than any other since she joined the boat. So why was he rushing her? She didn't know, but she didn't argue back though, instead picking up the pace as she scrubbed away at the lunchtime plates. Finally, when the food was complete, she was able to leave the stiflingly hot room and get some fresh air. Not that the hot summer air outside was any better. There didn't even seem to be a breeze as she stepped out onto the deck, staring out onto the calm waters of the ocean. She hadn't seen land for several days now, with the families above actively avoiding the sight of anyone else. She wouldn't mind, but as she was consistently reminded, she was not to be seen or heard unless actively asked for, which meant the only times she could truly enjoy the daylight were in these little breaks between chaotic shifts. It was beautiful though, that much she couldn't deny. The sun was making its way across the horizon, turning the light blue hues of the sky to a beautiful array of yellows and oranges. She had never seen the sea so calm before. In fact, if it weren't for the little ripples glistening in the setting sun, she wouldn't think it was moving at all. It was as if the whole world had paused as she stood amongst the vast landscape of open blue. That was, until she began to stumble about, having to grip the bar of the railing in front of her to keep her steady, as the entirety of the yacht lurched upward from below, as if a huge wave had just passed. The peaceful silence was instantly disturbed by the sudden sounds of a metal bucket slamming against the floor in the distance, followed by the shattering of glass and a mixture of grumbles and laughter by the owners of the ship. Nobody seemed to be panicked though. Well, nobody except the waitstaff, who Rachel could hear scrambling about to clean up the mess that had obviously occurred. She hadn't let go of the railing yet though, with it feeling looser under the sweat of her palms. She hadn't been on the boat for that long, so she didn't know what to expect in these kind of situations. She knew that something didn't feel right here. She knew that, but that wasn't something she'd ever experienced or even heard of before. The contemplation that would come, however, was disturbed before it could even begin, as a loud slam collided with the ship from the other side, instantly knocking her to the ground. She was lucky she was still holding on, as if she wasn't, she would likely have flipped straight over and into the waters below. This time, it seemed, everyone had begun to panic, as a variety of yelling voices and harsh demands echoed through the ship. So many voices that nothing could quite clearly be made out in the chaos of it all. She didn't know what to do. Did she run and help, or should she stay out of the way? What was even going on? She hadn't had the chance to have a proper introduction in what to do in case of an emergency, bar the usual talks on what to do if the ship was sinking. Now the ship had begun to sway with intensity, as if they were in the midst of a ferocious storm that seemed to only affect their vessel. She didn't let go of the railing. She couldn't. What if she fell again? And so she clung on as tightly as possible, wrapping her arms around it to hold her tightly, forcing her face against the indents of her elbow to keep herself secure. She opened her eyes, trying to keep herself as alert as possible, trying to understand what was happening as she glanced down into the rapid waters below. But what she saw only confused her further. Surrounding the ship, deep within the water, was what looked to be an extremely large, shadowy patch, as if they had accidentally hit a shallow part of the sea. She lifted her head slightly, peering over to get a better look. Now, she could make out its surface. It was black and grey, like huge, slippery boulders on its surface, although, curiously, they seemed to be growing larger and larger by the second. It wasn't long before two things became very clear to her. Firstly, this block of land was getting closer. And secondly, they were not rocks at all, but the strange texture of a giant creature that was rising at a horrifying speed. Now it was time to let go of the railing. She dived as fast as she could back inside, slamming the door behind her before charging down the stairs to the kitchen. The chef may have been a pain in the ass, but at least she knew him, and she knew he knew what to do in this situation. Unfortunately though, by the time she got there, he was already charging his way past her, darting up the stairs, shouting for her to stay put, whilst wielding a kitchen knife as if that was going to do anything. Even so, she did as he told her, just standing in a windowless room filled with pots and pans that were now gliding around the room as the yacht swayed side to side in an indistinguishable pattern. The ship began to creak and moan as loud bangs echoed through the walls around her. Soon enough, the screaming had started as the creaks evolved into horrifying snaps and cracks. The sound of metal and wood slamming together blasted down the hall as the lights above began to flicker, dropping her in and out of darkness. She had to leave. She pulled open the kitchen door and began making her way up the stairs once again, trying not to focus too heavily on the ever-growing stream of water that began to seep its way down every step like a dreaded waterfall. When she reached the top, she peered out through the glass to see where the guests had once sat. The tables and chairs were now tipped across the floor, scattered as if a great gust of wind had blasted them across the boat. And finally, she saw one of them, a woman crawling across the ground as if keeping herself low and out of sight, blood pouring down the side of her head. She looked as though she was crying, although she was so drenched from top to bottom that the tears instantly blended in with the seawater that she was covered in. Rachel felt the urge to go and help her. She felt the desire to grab her and pull her into the safety of inside. But was it safe? What could have possibly been the right thing to do in this situation? A loud crack and bang echoed up the stairway, as if the hull had broken through, causing the various metal objects to slam across the room with great force. It seemed this assumption was the correct one, as within seconds, a huge blast of water flung open the kitchen door from inside, swirling and smashing its way up the stairs as the boat began to sink. With that, Rachel instantly darted forward, heading to the glass doors to get to the hurt woman outside. She grabbed the handle and yanked at it as hard as she could, but it didn't budge, only clanking as metal on metal collided above it as if something was jammed. She growled in frustration, pulling at it again, growing increasingly aware that if she didn't get out quickly, the water that was sharply rising behind her would drown her where she stood. Finally though, as the ship swirled heavily to the left once again, whatever was jamming the door had come loose, allowing the door to slam open. She watched as the woman began to slide across the floor, edging closer to the promenade. However, before the woman could disappear out of sight, something happened that both shocked and horrified Rachel in equal measure. An enormous, powerful tentacle flung down into sight, instantly wrapping the woman up in its grip as its sharp spikes that circled its suckers dug into her waist. She screamed in horror as it lifted her and dragged her away, disappearing into the waters below. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. What was she to do now? How was this even possible? It turned out, though, that she never had a choice in what to do anyway. As the ship's deck began to rise into the air, as the monstrous tentacles began to wrap themselves around the boat like a snake choking out its prey, Rachel flung back, slamming into the water as the ship now stood vertically, quickly sinking into the depths below. The lights finally gave out, giving a final flicker of light before dropping her into darkness as she thrashed through the waters around her, clambering for the light beyond the doorway she could see at the end of the corridor. She swam with all of her might, already feeling her lungs struggle as she quickly ran out of breath. She wouldn't have made it if the glass hadn't already shattered, giving her a way to get out of the ship before it was gone. As she exited, she could barely see a thing, surrounded by nothing but a large dark mass, obstructed by millions of foaming bubbles swirling around her. She wanted to swim away, that's what she needed to do, but if she didn't reach the surface right away, she wasn't going to make it. And so instead, she made her way up. She broke the surface with such fright and desperation that she let out a breathless scream with her gasps for air. But even then, she felt her arms automatically thrashing at the water as she tried to move away from the boat. She turned back only once as the ship let out a large, deep moan as if performing its swan song to the ocean, as the horrifying tentacles dragged it deep below the surface, leaving nothing but several metal trays, random planks of wood, fruit, and luckily for her, a small raft that the crew had clearly opened but were unable to get to in time. By the time she had clambered inside, the sun had almost entirely disappeared over the horizon. Many of the pieces that had previously floated amongst the rocky surface of the waters had already sunk into the deep blue sea, leaving no evidence of the yacht's existence outside of her and her raft. Even the sea itself had returned to normal, with the gentle waves rocking her raft from side to side. Was it going to come back for her? She didn't know. And at this point, she was too tired to care. And so she lay on her back and looked up at the darkening sky, hoping not only that she would survive the night, but that she would even be found in the wide landscape of the blue planet. The Kraken's history is as wide and as deep as the vast ocean itself, reaching back into older Scandinavian sea lore, where sailors would spend days or even weeks without land, opening them up to a realm of distortion and fear. One of the earliest surviving descriptions of what would later be known as the Kraken appears in a text titled The King's Mirror. This was a Norwegian didactic work from the mid-13th century, where the creature is described as something so vast that it seemed more like an island than a fish. Here, it seems as though the creature was seen more as a strange shape in the distance, confusing sailors with its shifting scale and deceptive horizon. Then, there are the traditional descriptions tied to Old Norse literature. Here, there is a creature known as Hafgufa, a sea monster immense enough that it holds the ability to swallow ships and anything else within its reach. That said, these medieval texts don't just give us a singular proto-Kraken that evolved over time, and instead, these texts tell of a cluster of related maritime terrors. As alongside the Hafgufa is also the Lingback, which is likewise said to resemble an island of some sort. Then there is Aspidocalone, a gigantic sea creature often imagined as a whale-like beast, so enormous that sailors mistook its back for an island, landed on it, and lit fires before being dragged beneath the waves when it submerged. This motif doesn't just appear in Scandinavian countries though, as very similar ideas can also be found in Old English literature under the name of Fastetokalon. This is a monstrous whale island described in The Whale, an old poem. Here, the creature is not dangerous because of a direct attack, but because it confuses sailors, resembling refuge and a place for them to stop. A related version of this story also survives in the Christian voyage Legends of St. Brendan, where the monks land on what they think is an island, only to discover that it is the giant sea creature Jasconius. A similar creature also appears in saga literature, such as Oliver Orde saga, generally thought to have been written in the latter part of the 13th century, where monstrous sea beings appear regularly. Ones that in recent years have often been connected to the wider tradition from which the Kraken legend would later emerge. Strictly speaking though, these creatures are not yet the Kraken in the later sense, so it would instead be more accurate to say that they belong to the older imaginative world that the Kraken would eventually grow out of, rather than early depictions of the creature itself. In fact, even the word Kraken belongs to a far later stage of the legend. The word appears in English from the mid-18th century, stemming from the Norwegian language, where it had already been in use for much longer, where it was written down as early as 1646, when it appeared in a Norwegian glossary by Kristen Jensen. By the early modern period though, the legend had become more specific in both its description and its explanation. Exactly when this shift happened and in what precise way is seemingly lost to time. But there is a useful bridge to be found between the older medieval sea lore and the later Kraken accounts. Writing in the first half of the 18th century, Hans Egede, a Norwegian Lutheran missionary and explorer, connected the Kraken of Norwegian fishermen's lore with the older Hafgufa tradition, helping to draw a clearer line between the sea monsters of medieval writing and the creature that would later become far more widely known as the Kraken. Not long after, Erik Pontoppidan published Natural History of Norway in the 1750s, and it is this piece of work that is often cited as the single most influential early modern account of the Kraken legend. In this book, he gathered anecdotes from fishermen and sailors, treating the creature as though it truly belonged, however uncertainly, to the natural world rather than to the realm of pure superstition. In these later Norwegian accounts, the Kraken was often said to reveal itself in deceptively calm waters rather than in the cinematic, dramatic storms that you may imagine. Here, it was described as first appearing as a dark mass on an otherwise flat horizon, or as a shallow rise where there should have been only open water. And at the sight of either of these, sailors would need to remain vigilant, as this could well be the first sign that something immense was now lurking beneath the surface. Fishermen were often said to watch the depth carefully, because if the sea suddenly seemed far shallower than they had originally expected, it might very well mean that the Kraken was rising from below. That being said, the Kraken was not always imagined as a malevolent thing that sailors should fear. as one of the more interesting features of later tradition was its association with abundance alongside its danger. Pontoppidan also recorded the belief that large shoals of fish gathered around the creature and that the waters near it could yield an unusually rich catch, with this attraction repeatedly being connected to the foul, turbid matter it released into the sea. Now, this gave the legend a strange duality, as the creature could and most definitely was feared as a force of destruction, although it was also sought out as a source of fortune. That same duality perhaps goes some way in explaining why the Kraken became such a useful explanation for disasters, as throughout history, sudden shipwrecks and unexplained disappearances at sea were sometimes also blamed on the creature. Now, as you may expect, this wasn't due to eyewitness testimony, but more because vessels could vanish out in the open ocean, leaving behind no clear explanation at all. In that sense, the Kraken was not only an explanation, but a representation of the suspicion many held towards the vast and hostile landscape of the open sea. A suspicion that, in many ways, still lingers with us now. Later, particularly in Norwegian tradition, the way the Kraken was said to destroy ships became more specific. Rather than simply dragging vessels down with brute force, it was increasingly associated with violent disturbances in the sea itself. In these accounts, the creature was known to sink beneath the surface, leaving the water above it churning, drawing ships into dangerous circular motions. This is likely heavily connected to what is known as muskonstrømmen, often linked in English to the word maelstrom, a powerful tidal current in the Norwegian Sea around the Lofoten Islands of northern Norway. Scientifically speaking, what people refer to as a maelstrom is better described as a large whirlpool, formed when the strong tides, currents, wind, and underwater topography interact in a way that create swirling eddies and a vortex-like motion. With this in mind, it is easy to see why this region became such a compelling backdrop for Kraken folklore over the years. Waters like these could appear unnervingly calm at one moment, and then shift into violent turbulence the next as the tides suddenly changed. And for the sailors moving through them without modern forecasting or oceanographic knowledge, that kind of instability would have felt extremely ominous, with the beast not only said to live amongst the waters, but also, in many ways, personifying them. For centuries, the way the Kraken was described was kept vague, with it being more often talked about as a general large mass of a monster, with people describing it more as being vast or island-like. This made the entity more of an idea than a tangible creature they could imagine, with many often filling the gaps with their own horrifying thoughts, making it all the more terrifying, as many who would have even seen enough of the Kraken to have a description of it would have never lived to pass on that information anyway. This, however, began to change in the early 19th century, as in 1801, the French naturalist Pierre Denis de Montfort published one of the most influential images in the history of the legend, showing a colossal cephalopod attacking a ship. It was here that the Kraken began to look much more like the creature modern audiences would recognize. No longer simply an immense and ambiguous terror of the sea, but something with grasping limbs, a body more clearly aligned with the octopus or squid, and a violence that could now be pictured in a single striking image. Perhaps it is due to the alien nature of cephalopods, already making them unnerving, fascinating, and mysterious to many that ensured this imagery stuck so intensely. But before long, any mention of the Kraken would instantly be associated with this tentacled horror, helped along not only by illustration, but by the wider 19th century appetite for the monstrous and sublime. Nearly 3 decades later, in 1830, Alfred Tennyson published The Kraken in Poems, presenting the creature not as a practical hazard from sailors' lore, but as an ancient and slumbering power hidden in the abyss. By the time Jules Verne was writing later in the 19th century, the association between the Kraken and the colossal cephalopods had only grown stronger, likely due to the famous 1861 encounter involving the French corvette Alacton. While sailing near Tenerife in the Canary Islands, the crew of Alacton repeatedly spotted what they described as an enormous squid on the surface of the water. At that point, giant squid were only known of in small circles, as pieces of them had been found before, with rumours travelling for years. However, this creature still seemed to many like something that instead belonged between reality and mythology. Captain Frederick Boyer and his men tried to seize the animal, first firing at it, then throwing harpoons, and finally managing to get a rope around its body. But when they attempted to haul it aboard, the flesh tore under the strain and only part of the animal was recovered. This wasn't ideal, but it was enough to prove that they had truly found what they claimed to have found, and this evidence would only muddy the waters of its legend further. And once that possibility had entered the public imagination, it became far more difficult to dismiss the old stories outright. The sea monster was no longer only a thing of folklore, nor merely a shape conjured from fear and distance. Now, there seemed to be evidence that the deep really did hold creatures far larger and stranger than most people had ever imagined, as the line between the monstrous and the real did not feel quite so solid. From there, reports and discoveries would continue to surface as strange carcasses washed ashore and fragments of large creatures were recovered from the stomachs of whales. Sailors, fishermen, and later scientists all found themselves piecing together the outline of an animal that would have once been deemed nothing but a folkloric creature. No full specimen had been found yet, though, and all of the understanding of the animals was based on the fragments that could be collected, only adding to the strange mystery of the beings. In fact, no real sighting would be documented until centuries later, and so, when we consider the fact that an animal of that size could remain uncertain for so long, it naturally opens us up to a far more intriguing and unnerving question. What else could still be down there that we are yet to discover? What other life may exist in parts of the ocean we have barely reached, let alone understood? Perhaps that is why the Kraken still lingers so powerfully in the imagination to this very day, as, even now, the ocean continues to remind us of just how little we know of its depths. When we take into account the fact that creatures as extraordinary as the giant squid can exist, hidden for so long in the darkness, then these stories of a Kraken begin to feel a little bit more plausible. If you're still listening, you likely share the same fascination with strange stories and unexplained legends that I do. And for just £3 a month on Patreon, you can unlock Modern Myths, an exclusive bonus series with 8 extra episodes each season. From the Black-Eyed Children to the Thunderbird, these are tales too curious to leave untold. You'll also get behind-the-scenes insights, discounts on merch, and access to our private community chat where you can connect with me and other folklore fans. I even name characters in my stories after patrons at random, so your name could become part of the retellings themselves. Your support fuels the research and the production and ensures our understanding of these legends continues to grow. Click the Patreon link in our show notes to join us, and together we'll keep folklore alive. But for now, back to the legend. Architeuthis dux, widely known as the giant squid, is a very real, large and elusive animal in our world. One that has evolved from a mythical creature to a strange mystery before finally being understood as a legitimate animal of our ocean's depths. The Natural History Museum notes that giant squids were first formally classified by Western science in 1857, and that females are thought to reach around 13 meters in length, with males being somewhat smaller. Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History similarly notes that the largest scientifically recorded giant squid was, incredibly, almost 43 feet, or about 13 meters in length. Part of what made the giant squid so difficult to pin down scientifically for so long was the fact that, for many years, most of what researchers had were mere fragments of the animal. Beaks turned up in sperm whale stomachs, damaged carcasses washed ashore, and on occasion, parts of the animal were hauled up by fishermen or found floating at the surface already half dead. In fact, Smithsonian still notes that much of what we know, even today, comes primarily from stranded bodies rather than repeated observation of healthy animals in their natural environment. It wasn't until as recently as 2004 that the first photographs of a living giant squid in its natural habitat were taken. And even then, clear footage remained exceptionally rare for years afterwards. Anatomically, the giant squid is strange enough that it's easy to see how its sightings may have added to the legend of the Kraken in some ways. It has 8 enormous arms on its body, but also 2 much longer feeding tentacles that it uses to seize its prey. And these tentacles have the ability to extend to more than twice the length of its body, with their clubs lined with powerful suckers. Once it has its prey, it is drawn in towards a hard beak, then broken down further by the radula, a tooth-lined tongue-like structure. Its eyes are also noteworthy due to their immense size, as each eyeball is able to reach about a foot wide, which significantly helps it to function in the darkness of the deep. This also explains why it has remained so elusive for so long, as it is known to live between roughly 200 to 1,400 meters below the surface of the ocean, far below the zone in which human beings have historically been able to access. Down there, light falls away quickly, and at certain points, the light disappears completely. Most of us are aware by now of the many strange and mysterious creatures that are said to live down there, and many of us are also aware of how little of it we have explored even today. With that in mind, you can see why the notion that a creature that is at least somewhat closer to the Kraken of folklore is thought to still potentially exist out there. For years, scientists only knew of the giant squid indirectly, found through signs of its existence before any real proof was actually found. To those who believe in cryptids today, this concept would feel eerily familiar, And the fact that it turned out to be a very real animal may only solidify those beliefs. Scars were often found on the sides of large animals, with sperm whales often found with strange sucker marks on their skin, suggesting a great fight between the two titans of the sea. This is because sperm whales are the major confirmed predator of fully grown giant squid, and that the scars seen on stranded whales are effectively evidence of violent encounters happening far below the surface, even if no human has ever watched one in full. The 2004 major breakthrough in seeing one alive happened when researchers used baited equipment off the Ogasawara Islands. From there, they obtained the first photographs of a living giant squid in its natural habitat, with the images published the following year. The animal attacked the lure and tore off one of its own tentacles in the process, which was later used to confirm the species through DNA sampling. The next great leap came in 2012, when the giant squid was finally filmed in its natural habitat. This time, researchers used glowing lures outside a submersible to mimic jellyfish and draw the animal in. More recently, live footage has begun to accumulate, though still very rarely. In 2019, an NOAA-funded expedition filmed what experts identified as a juvenile giant squid in the Gulf of Mexico at the depth of about 759 meters, the first such footage from US waters. Even so, we still know very little about these giant creatures, just as we still know very little about what truly is happening in the darkness of our deepest oceans. And that uncertainty will naturally open doors to intriguing questions and folkloric ideas. It would be easy to dismiss these tales of sea monsters as nothing but our ignorant ancestors' imagination. And although I may not personally believe that a creature the size of a kraken truly exists out there, it is worth noting that time and time again, the ocean has revealed animals that once seemed too bizarre to truly exist. With all that said, science gives us no real reason to believe there is a many-tentacled island beast capable of dragging whole ships beneath the waves. Giant squid themselves, for all their scale, still do not match anywhere near the impossible sizes often claimed in folklore. The sea itself holds a remarkable scale. Our world is referred to as the blue planet after all. So perhaps the more unsettling point is not that a true kraken-like beast is likely waiting to be discovered out there, but more that the ocean has never stopped proving itself capable of surprise. Even now, so much of the deep remains difficult to access, expensive to study, and only partially understood. In a place like that, the possibility of large, unfamiliar, or rarely seen animals do not feel so absurd at all. In fact, there is most definitely a number of strange creatures that we still have no idea exist in the world. The Kraken legend didn't appear from various sightings of giant squid, however, as we remember that the squid-like imagery didn't even appear until the 19th century. Instead, the giant squid serves as a reminder that there are things stranger and far larger than we may currently know down there. The fact that it happened to look like the modern depictions of the Titan itself was just a very convenient coincidence and something that people would obviously make connections with. Over the years, the Kraken has gone by many names and has been described in many different ways, varying in color and size from tail to tail. However, they all represent the same thoughts, linked instead to a shared atmosphere of dread that comes with the enormous scale of the ocean. It is a part of our world that we are not adapted to be within. It's like a parallel universe that lives among us. One that we may never truly and fully explore.
Urban Legends is researched, written and produced by Luke Mordew, co-edited by Sophie Tickle, music by Billy Jupp, with additional sounds from Storyblocks and Envato. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please like and review our show on your chosen podcast provider. This simple task is a big part of our show's continuation and growth. To access more chapters through our bonus material, early releases, ad-free content, and more, become a patron by clicking the link in our show notes. To follow us on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube, simply search Urban Legends Folklore or visit lukemordew.com/podcast. If you have more information or a correction on anything said, email us on luke@lukemordew.com. We aim to ensure that all information provided is accurate and up to date, and this remains a top priority.